After 8 years in office and countless international crises, the time has come to evaluate Obama's foreign policy. Now, we, as Team Proposition, believe that it has done much more harm than good. And in order to properly evaluate this, we in this debate believe that it's important to first set some general criteria in order to evaluate what makes a good foreign policy in general. For this, we see two main criteria. First of all, efficiency, so that you achieve your goals while keeping bad side effects at a minimal level. That's because if you invest time and effort and such forth, you want something in return, and foreign policy is redundant if nobody profits from it. The second criteria is sustainability, so socially, economically, ecologically, and such forth. Because otherwise, foreign policy is redundant, and because the long term is more important than the short term, because otherwise you get risk getting pulled into a vicious circle. Now, we believe that these are general criteria. However, specifically if we're talking the United States, we believe that because of the specific situation of the U.S., because of its military and economic power, it's important to judge the U.S. through the eyes of the world and not only through the U.S. itself. Now, if in this debate we can prove these criteria are not fulfilled, and thus Obama's foreign policy has done more harm than good, we take this debate. Now, we believe that these criteria have not been fulfilled due to three general strategic flaws. First of all, a misprioritization of urgency. For example, focusing on Cuba while hundreds of thousands were dying in Syria and such forth. The second one is inconsistency, namely flip-flopping on relevant issues, for example, Syria. And the third one is timing, so what he did in his first term as opposed to second term, if we look at, for example, Cuba and Iran. So we will prove that these strategic flaws exist, and thus are burdened, namely that Obama has created more problems than he has solved during his time in office with the following arguments. As the first speaker, I will be talking about unsustainability and a passive strategy, and our second speaker will be talking about detrimental actions in regard to relations to allies. Now, before I come to my own arguments, I would like to make something absolutely clear on Team Proposition, namely our stance. It is that we neither condone or condemn a passive or an active strategy as a universal solution. However, we believe that Obama applied the wrong strategy in the wrong context, and this is why we believe that this was detrimental. Now let me come to my first argument, which is unsustainability of his actions. Now what do we mean with this? What we mean is that there was an immediate focus on overthrowing a dictator or an authoritarian regime without focusing on the individual context of the country. For example, looking at the economic situation, looking at the political and social context, or looking at possible political alternatives. Now, we believe that this is so important because these are all factors that determine how vulnerable a country is to instability. And these are thus crucial for determining whether or not a country can handle a political transition or not. Now, we believe that because these were not regarded, this is actually misprioritization of urgency and one of our main strategic flaws. Now, the failure to regard these individual factors can lead to two catastrophic outcomes, which we see in what has happened. First of all, anarchy. So what happens if you overthrow an authoritarian regime or dictator is that often there is a power vacuum, and a situation in many want to be in power, but nobody is powerful enough to actually control the entire country. This is detrimental because it leads to absolute chaos, and everybody can do what they want, there's no certainty and no structures and such forth. The best example where we see this general principle happening is in Libya, where the short-term goal of the US was, let's get Gaddafi out. But now we have a situation that's much worse, with ISIS, for example, controlling half of the country in absolute chaos. The second alternative that can happen is a relapse into dictatorship, but before a point of information.
Are you aware that President Obama actually went in the request of European countries and not their task?
Well, actually, Obama was the one that led this mission in Libya, and he was actually the one that led this UN mission, and that's why it is indeed the US's responsibility in this case, so your point falls. Now, the second alternative is this relapse into dictatorship. Now, why is this the case? Because often it is the case that the new government which was installed cannot hold itself due to the political turmoil and instability in this country. Now, this is bad because the new dictatorship can lead to two bad things. First of all, revenge. So revenge against the protesters or the old dictatorship. Or secondly, fear of new uprising, which causes the new dictatorship to often be even more suppressive than the last one. The best example where we see this happening is Egypt, where Mubarak was overthrown. But now we have a much, much worse situation in Egypt, where, for example, we've had over 600 public executions of Morsi supporters, and the freedom of assembly has been severely limited. And, for example, also 480 NGOs have simply been shut down. And specifically, if we talk about Egypt, the situation is even worse than this because we actually also have monopoly of power due to the fact that Egypt is now a military dictatorship. Now, we believe on this basis of unsustainability alone, our efficiency and sustainability criteria of what makes a good foreign policy crumble. But this is because the goal was to get something better than you had before. However, both of these alternatives, both anarchy and relapse into dictatorship, as I've shown you, are something much worse than before. However, besides this unsustainability strategy, we see another big failure of Obama's strategy, namely quite the opposite, namely a passive strategy. This is basically the belief in the responsibility of the people to solve the conflicts in their own country, something that was most practiced in the Middle East, but also Ukraine and Georgia. Now, why did Obama generally believe that this was a good strategy to follow? There were two reasons. First of all, that he had no interest in the majority of global regions. For example, that he saw Southeast Asia as the future, specifically economically, because there was no longer as much economic dependence on the Middle East, for example, for oil. The second reason is the failure of direct interventions in the past. For example, if we look at Iraq and Afghanistan. And these have led to the inherent belief that direct interventions are inherently destined to fail and are inherently bad. Now, this is often a problem because the state in these countries can either not take over the responsibility because the state is simply too weak, or secondly, shouldn't take over the responsibility because often if we look at authoritarian regimes or dictatorships, there's so many human rights violations, or the people are just trying to get rid of the dictator, that this is something that we shouldn't accept. Now, because of these two reasons, there is sometimes an obligation and a necessity to intervene specifically if we're looking at the US because of their military power and their economic power. Now, how did Obama's passive strategy fail? We see 5 reasons for this. First of all, if we look at the humanitarian crisis in Syria and such forth, where there's a death of over 400,000 in Syria, and a refugee crisis which has externally displaced over 6 million alone. And this is bad also because it's an example of inconsistency, because Obama flip-flopped on this issue, initially saying that he was going to do airstrikes. The second thing is overspill of conflicts into neighboring countries. This is bad because it further destabilizes the entire region, something that we see with the Syrian conflict, which spilled over into Lebanon, where now pro and anti groups, Assad groups, are fighting each other. And this leads to more turmoil and the fact that 1 million refugees in this country are sucked back into the conflict they originally fell from. The third one is empowerment of unreliable non-state actors. And this is a problem because you have no control over your weapons and you don't know what's happening with them. A good example for this is the Free Syrian Army, where fighters went to ISIS. The fourth one is anti-American sentiments, which can lead to radicalization because help is denied. A good example for this is, for example, Ukrainians, which were hoping for American support during the Crimean crisis and didn't get it. The fifth one is more leverage for authoritarian regimes, because if the US is passive, there is no democratic counterbalance to authoritarian regimes in other countries. For example, if we look at China and their presence in sub-Saharan Africa, how they're exploiting Congo. And because we see all of these general flaws, because Obama failed to use the correct strategy, we believe that our criteria for good foreign policy fall, and this debate definitely must stand.
Let us imagine a dusty plain of Baghdad. A child looks over to the horizon. No American tanks. ISIS way up north. The Iraqi army marching forth. Iraq being made great again. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The motion before us today is this House believes that the Obama administration's foreign policy has done more harm than good. We'd like to begin by defining some key aspects of today's motion, given that the proposition apparently forgot to do so. The Obama administration, the United States government under the command of President Obama since the year 2008. Now, what is foreign policy? Though we agree with the two elements that they presented. The self-interested strategies chosen by the state to safeguard its national interest and to achieve goals within its international relations. Now, team proposition must prove one important thing on today's debate that they, again, conveniently forgot to mention. And it is this, that they did not generate more harms, firstly to the homeland, and then to the rest of the world. Now, we'll be developing our case into 3 main arguments. Number 1, peace for our time. Number 2, the crystal ball. And number 3, the real war. Now, let us begin by addressing the key arguments presented by team proposition. So they came up with this first argument, talking about the importance of the economic and the social aspects, and how apparently the American economic power has been downgraded in the world. No analysis, no example of how this actually happened, and even if it was so, we have a couple of responses for that. First one being that the United States actually increased its presence in the Asia-Pacific region, granting even more economic access, and the US is still the largest economy in the world. Again, no analysis on how this really applies. And then they moved on with the point of overthrowing dictators and Libya. We asked in a POI, were the European countries such as France and the United Kingdom that asked for American help when they couldn't do the job? Yes, Americans did their job, what was to get in, bomb, and help those Europeans, and then these European countries and the European Union were supposed to stabilize the country. And it wasn't possible for the United States to stay on the ground. What would you prefer? Another Iraq with hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground, billions of dollars in expenditure, and unwinnable war? We believe that we are smarter than that. And as it comes to Egypt, they presented, oh, this marvelous revolution. I would like to remind you that the revolution that overthrew Mr. Mubarak was a people's revolution, and this new dictatorship that it could be debatable. It is in fact a dictatorship. Where is the link that this is a dictatorship supported by the United States? Again, no link, no analysis from team proposition. And then they move on with their second argument, talking about the US solving world conflicts. We'd like to pose an important question for team proposition. Do they think that the United States must solve all world conflicts? No, thank you. And this is an important fact. Why? Because they say, oh, we have a lot of these problems, wars going on here and there. But the question is, the United States must safeguard firstly its interests and then look out for the world, because it is not up for them to solve all conflicts. And then they mentioned human rights being violated. Of course they're being violated, but that's the task of the United Nations to safeguard them. And they mentioned the example of Syria. The US had a strong diplomatic stance as comes to fighting the situation over there. And then they said, well, don't leave it out to the locals to fight their own wars. No, we'll come in there for you. The United States will solve every world conflict. No, ladies and gentlemen, this is precisely the point that locals need to fight their own wars. They need to stand their own ground. And then they mentioned the example of Crimea and terrorism. Terrorism is actually being downgraded. An example of Crimea. Diplomatic sanctions instead of war were applied, and the Russian economy is now crumbling. Now let us begin with our case. The first argument, peace for our time, divided into three the most important pillars in the Obama doctrine in this past years. Number one, limiting the use of armed forces. Number two, restoring relations. And number three, reaching consensus. Why? Because the first priority for foreign policy needs to be the homeland and then turn towards the world. So we'll be analyzing the trends in foreign policy and not just examples on this point. Now let's begin with limiting the use of armed forces. There's a couple of reasons why this actually took place. One, getting troops out of harm's way. Two, reducing the unimaginable cost. And three, getting out of unwinnable and counterproductive wars, saving lives. In Iraq, we went from having 180,000 troops in the year 2010 to 0. In Afghanistan, from 100,000 to 9,000, getting Americans out of harm's way for no apparent reason. As it comes to the cost, we cannot expect the US to maintain these wars indefinitely. Afghanistan and Iraq combined $7.3 trillion. That is 2 GDPs of Germany, ladies and gentlemen, just on the cost of the war, so bear that in mind. And number three, and winnable and counterproductive, Iraq. It had a huge insurgency against the United States. It made it absolutely unwinnable with terrorist attacks happening all the time. And it was counterproductive. Why? Because if you go along bombing Muslim countries, these Muslim countries then use that rhetoric to fuel terrorism and recruit their soldiers. And then moving on to number two, restoring relations. The Obama policy was certainly mending all conflicts. For example, vestiges from the Cold War. Cuba that they mentioned, asking for concessions on human rights and improving the lives of Cubans now that the US is actually involved in trade. And again, the same with Vietnam. No, thank you. And number three, reaching consensus. Obama believes in getting partners for a safer world and allies to solve world conflicts and his own. A great example of this is the Iran nuclear deal. World powers and the United Nations were pulled together with the United States to reduce the amount of uranium stockpile by 98% and getting nuclear weapons out of possible Iran. And number two, Russia. Sanctions being in place for Crimea, the ruble losing 60% of its value, and again, not going into an unnecessary war. So we've proven you, one, the positive lessons of intervention. Number two, the restoring of diplomacy and its importance. And number three, the reaching of consensus. Now, before I move on with my second point, we'll take a point from the proposition.
You do realize that you're completely misrepresenting our side, because we said that we aren't solely for an active strategy, but we believe that it's used both in the wrong context.
I get your point, but the first one being, the first answer for that is that I'm not mischaracterizing what you're saying. The thing is that you lack analysis and you lack examples of your basic concepts, therefore it's quite difficult to engage. Number two, crystal ball. We have to make a cost-benefit analysis, the actual situation on the ground, and what Obama did, and the possible repercussions that could have for the homeland and the world in two aspects. Terrorism and pivot to the East. As it comes to terrorism, when he took office, he had a pledge to end the war on terror. Let me remind you that there were thousands of American troops being killed in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and hundreds of thousands of civilians actually being killed. So he changed the strategy of going over there and invading countries into a new policy. Airstrikes and drone strikes that actually, one, killed Osama bin Laden, brought justice to 9/11, and two, Al-Qaeda is almost completely degraded, and ISIS has lost 2/3 of its territory, and the final push for Mosul is about to begin. Now, number two, the pivot to the East. He saw a rising economic China, and what did he do to that? With the Asian region, he increased trade. Vietnam plus 380%, with Indonesia plus 50%, so countering the economic assertions of China. And with the military, of course, a new military assertive China in the East, new military alliances with Vietnam, with Malaysia, with Indonesia, and the fleet out of time in the Pacific. So again, not going into direct conflicts that could be one, costly, two, unwinnable, and three, maybe with China, even could cause World War III. So on this side of the house, we ask you, why does the US need to solve world conflicts? We'd like an answer in the second speaker. So it's probably one, countering terrorism, and two, countering China, and trying to turn to the East because of its importance. That is why, Mr. Speaker, from Team Opposition, we believe that the State of the Union is strong. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what was completely misunderstood by the first speaker of side opposition in today's debate is that side proposition in today's debate is not promoting any active nor passive strategy, but that what we are saying is that Obama used the two means to act in the wrong circumstance, and that's why his policy has done more harm than good. So what I'm going to do for you in today's debate is firstly, rebuttal what we've heard so far from side opposition, which was honestly just rebuttaling our example and not our principle level, and then second of all, coming to the reconstruction of our own case before I come to my own speech, which is bringing you the last argument of our case, which is about how we inappropriately handled relations to US allies. Now let me first come to some rebuttal. So, ladies and gentlemen, what they told us in today's debate was he put less focus on the military and had a more passive strategy, which is something good, inherently good. However, this is what we are not seeing in today's debate, because we think that we have to judge this circumstance-wise. And yes, he might have limited the armed forces, and he might have moved out of Iraq, and so on, but has this improved the situation? Because in Iraq, we've seen that he moved out way too early, because now, that is actually why ISIS was empowered so much, because after the US left, the Iraqi military could not take over the power or could not defend their country against ISIS, which already existed since like the beginning of the 2000s. And that's why, his policy actually did more harm than good in this case. And yes, he approached some new or old enemies, which is something that is good. However, concerning the example of Cuba, which was just thrown into the room, not really analyzed at all, we see that the impacts are very small, because looking at Cuba, he lifted some sanctions, not all sanctions. Most of the sanctions have to be lifted in agreement with the Congress, which is not likely to happen since already Democrats and Republicans are going against this. And the second thing we see is that actually we're empowering a system, a state in Cuba, which is still oppressing many people there, violating the human rights. The press is not free at all, which you can see on the press freedom index, where it's like place 146. So we're legitimizing the system by giving them now better economies. No, thank you. And then also concerning Iran, yes, we might have approached them, but what did we do for this in exchange? We made many concessions. We can't be sure whether Iran is not secretly developing any nuclear program, and therefore this is not really as impactful as opposition wants to present in today's debate. And then perhaps they also try to portray Russia as a very good example for a passive approach, but what we've seen is that Russia has extremely expansionist Yes.
Would you rather invade Russia?
No, of course not. We're telling you from the beginning on in our speech that we rather want to have, we don't directly support always a passive strategy, but we think that Obama did, in the case of Russia, the wrong thing, which has led to more harms. Okay, so having cleared that up, and the last thing about the terrorism approach of Obama, well, he might have killed Osama bin Laden, but as we see, Al-Qaeda still existed, as we see maybe 14 of the 15 leaders on Wikipedia, you can actually see this, have been killed by American drone strikes, which are actually only 2% of them efficient and killing many civilians. But apart from that, this doesn't mean that the IS is now defeated, right? And also, the territory gain was mostly to Peshmerga fighters, no thank you, and to the Iraqi military, then to the US who supported the FSR, which now mainly supports ISIS. So this was actually very counterproductive. So let me now come to the reconstruction of our own case, because the only thing they attacked was firstly the Libya example, saying, well, the EU asked for help, well, still we say, if the US says we lead a mission in Libya, we need to get rid of Gaddafi, which there actually wasn't such a necessity as, for example, in Tunisia, where people actually protested and wanted a change, then ladies and gentlemen, we see that they actually have to take the responsibility afterwards if they led the mission, which they didn't do. And then, for example, for Egypt, they tried to portray this as if Mubarak was so bad and now Sisi is better, but ladies and gentlemen, we see, as we clearly explained to you in our first speech, that there can be, that a new dictatorship's relapse is actually worse because we have revenge against the old people, and we gave you a perfect example about 600 public executions now under the reign of Sisi. Ladies and gentlemen, there hasn't been anything improved in Egypt. So we see that since the US has such a huge military, has so many relationships to other countries, also a variety of different allies, it can be seen as their responsibility because they have the means to act that they do in some certain times where, for example, in Syria, 400,000 people have already died. Maybe you should have interacted earlier. But let me now come to my own speech, which is about how he inappropriately handled the relations to US allies. Because what we see is that Obama continued to uphold and form relationships to countries with questionable regimes, looking at, for example, Cuba. And these ties to the US gave the allies a feeling of trust and legitimacy, which can lead to the misbehavior and the legitimization of such regimes, because the countries think they have a golden ticket to do almost anything because they're backed by the world superpower, right? So let me illustrate this by 2 examples. No, thank you. Firstly, the US accepted and passively supported Saudi Arabian bombings of Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen, although they were actually blacklisted by none other than the United Nations. And what they also did, they encouraged the oppression of a Shia minority in Bahrain because they lifted US embargoes on arms sales to the Bahrain Defense Force. So we see that this was very bad and had bad consequences. And the second thing is, he lost political leverage through half-hearted approaching his former enemies while distancing himself from paramilitarism. No, thank you. We see that this is not inherently bad. However, the way Obama did it was counterproductive. Why? Because through the half-hearted approaches, because they started so late at the end of the second term that they can't finish these approaches, and during this time of the office, the US failed to gain significant new allies. For example, looking at the Iran, we can't consider them an ally, right? Because there are still even new sanctions imposed on them economically. But on the other hand, this approach strengthened the relationships to Saudi Arabia and Israel significantly, which we considered an ally before. And then what we can also see as a second example is that the US distanced itself from Israel through criticism, which is not inherently bad, as the opposition would probably say. However, the way Obama used this criticism was bad because only weeks later, Israel started a full-on war in Gaza just because 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped because they felt insecure, because the US didn't back them anymore. So we see that this was very counterproductive and led to aggression and violence in the whole region. And still, Obama is also not really pro-Palestinians, continuing to refuse to talk to Hamas. So we see that he lost political leverage in this, and this is bad for 3 reasons. Firstly, because for the US as such, it weakens their power network, but secondly also because there's less potential for peace talks now, because the US, being a huge diplomatic power, is probably in the Middle East the only country that can get Israel to the negotiation table, and this becomes even unlikelier now. And the third thing is we can expect a backlash, and there's more potential for radicalization of abandoned allies. Looking at Iran, when Obama approached Iran, Sunnis in Saudi Arabia felt betrayed because Iran is the biggest rival and primarily Shiite. And therefore, because the US has strained more relationships than they've gained, and therefore jeopardized potentials for peace talks and political reconciliation, we see that clearly his foreign policy has done more harm harm than good, and we are proud to propose.
In politics, there's always been a tension between getting it first and getting it right. Ladies and gentlemen, Obama has done things right. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, we're opposing the motion. This House believes the Obama administration's foreign policy has done more harm than good. Now, what did the side proposition need to prove in order to win this debate? They need to prove that the foreign policy of the Obama administration actually created more harms, first to the homeland and then to the world as a whole, which we already tackled through two arguments, which were first, peace for our time, and two, the crystal ball, which spoke about the opportunity cost of other measures that could be proposed. So before beginning with the last argument for the side of opposition, which is the real war, we'd like to go through some refutation of the arguments presented thus far by Team Germany. So the first point they brought is how Obama was actually leaving these areas of war and creating a power gap, and how this was greatly detrimental and how it created instability. So for this we have a couple of responses. The first thing we will tell you is that this actual power gap is simply a consequence of Bush's interventionist policies that actually destabilized government. Since Obama, in fact, never destabilized the government, that was out of time, never intervened in any country. Second, we will tell you that by retrieving his influence, he actually avoided the expansion of unsustainable, dependable governments, such as the one we had in Iraq. Third, we tell you that people in these areas weren't responding to the US occupations. Why? Because there were cultural differences that the United States just couldn't bridge, and therefore the occupation itself was completely futile, apart from the fact that it was costing the United States billions of dollars and the death of civilian casualties, whether they were American lives or Syrian lives. No, thank you. Moreover, they brought this point on how we're creating an anti-American sentiment, to which we would respond by saying that the anti-American sentiment is actually created on their side when countries continue an illegitimate occupation without the consent or the respect of the local culture. We see on their side of the house, they actually are advocating for policies such as the one we had with Bush, that he intervened in Iraq, or policies such as the one where we intervened in Afghanistan. So we see on their side of the house, they create even more instability. And lastly, to tackle their example, now thank you, on why ISIS is actually one of the main leading consequences of this power gap, we would tell you on our side that actually ISIS started up in Syria and not in Iraq. So the United States never intervened in Syria. They themselves brought the case that ISIS was present since the 2000s. So we see, in fact, it wasn't Obama's fault that ISIS was created. It wasn't Obama's fault that ISIS was in power. No, thank you. So what is Obama doing nowadays? On our side, we told you that Obama is actually creating a lot of benefits to the people. We see he's actually implementing drone strikes that are actually called upon by the Syrian and the Iraqi government. So we see in most cases this measure is legitimate, in fact, and it is therefore creates less remorseful society, less negative consequences, less hate from the people in Iraq and Syria. We see on our side of the house we create a less anti-American sentiment, or on their side of the house they simply don't care. No, thank you. Then we continue on this point on what would be the alternative. In fact, the side of the proposition is advocating for more interventions. They're advocating for more work being created, when in fact they take this stance by saying, oh, the passive strategies are not working, we need to take something that is more active. Therefore, they're advocating for these problems. No, thank you. And for this, they actually brought the example of Russia. So we ask you on the side of the opposition, what would you want Obama to do with Russia? Would you want them to invade Russia? Would you want them to start World War III? For this, they have absolutely no answer. Why? Because the simple answer is that Obama did the best that he could do. Because invading Ukraine, invading Georgia, invading Crimea would have cost World War III. So we see on their side of the house, their active policies actually create much more detriments than what we put on our side of the house. And on this argument of the flip-flopping like a pancake, we believe that Obama's interventionist policies have actually been pretty constant. He actually has always decided not to intervene unless either the country asks for it, or whether its allies ask for it. So we see that Obama is actually not doing something that is completely radical. Then, thank you. On this point of the allies, we see how Obama has actually established diplomatic relations with other countries that he hadn't done in the past. And they're saying, oh, this is greatly bad. You cannot stand by countries such as Saudi Arabia, countries such as Cuba. We would tell you that the alternative is actually not establishing connections at all. Leaving these countries isolated, and in fact, when we do leave these countries isolated, what ends up happening is that the human rights violations actually increase, and we have no influence on what is happening in the land. We show these diplomatic relations are actually strategic for the United States, since they can protect human rights in these countries. Moreover, we told you that they are preventing Iran from getting a nuke. We believe that, moreover, they're creating a bridge between their allies, as is the case of Saudi Arabia. It's a strategic alliance in which they can now negotiate with Saudi Arabia and with Israel to prevent another conflict, something that they on their side of the house completely deny. So the last question we want to ask to them Is Obama really responsible for solving all world conflicts? We say no. Even though they want to hold the almighty United States accountable for everything, it is not their job. It is not the principal job of foreign policy to actually do it. For this they answer, oh, they can, so they should. Ladies and gentlemen, many countries can intervene, many countries have the military powers, such as China. Why aren't we holding Xi Jinping accountable for all these actions? We don't see any point. We believe the third speaker of the proposition should clarify why it's the United States' fault to actually solve Israel's problems, and why it's the United States' fault to actually prevent Israel from invading the Gaza Strip. Now, before moving with the last argument for the slide, which is the real world, I'll take all information.
Considering, however, that the US, as I explained in my own speech, is the only power that, for example, can get Israel to the negotiation table, wouldn't you see that he's jeopardizing
I understand your point. The thing is, we have two answers. First, we believe that the United States is not the only ally of Israel. We have other European nations that we're not holding accountable. But even if we take the second answer, that many other countries actually have the military power to intervene, have the influence over the area. No one is holding Russia accountable for not intervening in Syria, and Russia is actually an ally of Syria. Yet again, we're just holding the United States accountable. We see no proof of this. We see no one else. So let's move on to the last argument for the side, which is the real world. And although in this debate the side of the proposition wants to focus on wars and armed conflicts, which we have already tackled, we believe that there are other issues in foreign policy that actually need to be addressed in this debate. In this argument, we'll speak about the environmental policies that Obama has taken and how these were greatly beneficial to the world as a whole, apart from the homeland. So 2 layers of analysis. First, priorities, and second, the policy effects. So let's get to the first layer of analysis on the priorities. We believe that Obama's foreign policy has actually shifted their priorities to long-term issues, something they themselves consider something to be more public. So they're actually focusing on something that is more impactful, which is the war on climate change, for example. We see the United States Pentagon has deemed climate change as the preeminent threat to the human race, preeminent threat to homeland security. On our side of the house, we believe that continuing sea level rises would cause the flooding of all the United States East Coast. This is greatly detrimental, apart from the fact that it would displace 100 million people all around the world. We see how Obama has actually shifted their priorities into something that is more impactful and looking at the long term, no thinking at a time. Moreover, in a second layer of analysis, we tell you that the impacts were actually positive. We say that Obama was successful in at least starting a solution. Why? Because he's got more countries involved in the matter through establishing negotiations and raising awareness all throughout the world. So on our side, we bring tangible benefits that are present with concrete agreements, such as, for example, getting China to sign the Paris Agreement. We see the two greatest contaminating nations in the world have actually signed this policy and are actually looking to get more solutions on a greener economy in the future. We see that the United States is already shifting their policies, shifting their environmental laws, and limiting and restricting fracking, for example. This is greatly beneficial on our side. We believe that is very impactful on their side as well. Moreover, we will tell that even if none of these benefits were seen nowadays, he's creating the awareness that an issue of this magnitude deserves, and therefore he already gets the benefits in the short term and in the long term. That is why, Mr. Speaker, on our side of the House, we are here to tell you that the State of the Union is strong. Thank you.
From the very start of this debate, Side Proposition came to you with a very clear stance. Side Proposition said that they neither condone nor condemn either active or passive strategy. But what we say are two things. That first of all, in the wrong context, the wrong solutions were used by Obama administrations. And secondly, what they also did was ignoring all the viable solutions that were there. The other point, like the other part of our stance in today's debate, is that Obama created more problems than he fixed, something we could both agree on that those were the burdens in today's debate. So what I'm going to do as the whip speaker on the proposition side is to first of all talk about unsustainability of Obama's administration, his foreign policy, and then secondly about passive strategy, thirdly about the relations to US allies and the environment. So first of all, on the framing of the unsustainability point, we have two things to say. Of course, it is not America's responsibility to solve all conflicts in the world. However, we see two problems. First of all, when the UN Security Council or the UN in general is incapable of mediating between two nations, and you're the only power that is actually capable of doing that, for example, in the case of Israel and Palestine, then you have taken over responsibility to actually do something. But what we secondly say is that when you topple a regime in Libya, when you actually make it possible that a regime is toppled in Egypt, then you are the one that voluntarily takes over the responsibility for this country, takes over the responsibility for rebuilding a nation there. Two things that said opposition did wrong on that point. First of all, the principal level of our argument was never tackled by the other side, saying that first of all, we were just focusing on overthrowing dictators without taking into consideration the individual's situation and how you have to act according to the circumstances. We say that this has led to different things, like anarchy, like collapse into dictatorship. They were criticizing us on we weren't clear. What we say on Libya and Egypt, it would have been better to not intervene. Even though we're not here to actually defend any other viable solution, we just have to say that there are other solutions that might have not led to the detrimental situation we have right now on Libya. First of all, the UN actually had a mandate, yes. The one who led the intervention in Libya was the United States, with their money and with their incentives. And by that, they took over the responsibility, they failed, half of the country is now governed by ISIS. Second example, Egypt. We say that where we are now is in no way comparable to where we were with Mubarak. Why? Because even though he was a dictator, the situation was fairly stable at that time. Now what the US did is, even though they didn't place boots on the ground, they increased anti-Mubarak sentiments, they supported actively anti-Mubarak movements, which led to the al-Sisi dictatorship that we have at the moment, that is gruesomely killing 600 public executions, and has already imprisoned 12,000 journalists. Two more examples on sustainability were Iraq and Syria in this debate. So we say that the creation of ISIS might not be Obama's fault in the first place, that the origins of this might be in the beginning of the 21st century, but we say that the premature withdrawal of troops out of Iraq means that there was no power anymore to contain Islamist thoughts in this country, and that is why ISIS has grown exponentially since the 2010s. We also say that the opposition's claim that ISIS is suddenly weaker at the moment is not true. We see terrorist attacks inspired by ISIS on a weekly basis, sadly, right now. We say that there's really nothing that they can be proud of. Okay. We say, on Syria, the red line that Obama painted for himself, that he didn't follow through on it, was an inconsistency, meant that he lost legitimacy. We also say that secondly, he ignored solutions like airstrikes, like no-fly zone, and just created an alliance that is ineffective because of the diversity of incentives of the countries that are in that. No, thank you. What we say is that the few military successes that we have in Iraq and Syria are mostly due to the Peshmerga, the Kurdish militia that is actually not supported by the United States because they decide to rather go with Turkey, their NATO ally, on difficult questions. Okay. Second point is the passive strategy. Before that,
you said that you weren't in favor of active intervention, but then you just criticized them for not using airstrikes. So why are you contradicting?
No. What we're saying is that what Obama did was the wrong solution in the wrong context. What we do have to do is to assess what Obama did and then ask, did we have problems now? Do we have more problems now, or did he fix more problems? Okay. On the passive strategy, again, they didn't attack us on a principal level. So it had to turn into a listing of examples, which is kind of sad to do by their part. Okay, so what we said in the passive strategy is that Obama was in some cases against direct interventions, because he was believing in a self-regulation process of the situations, for example, in Russia and Ukraine. We say that this was harmful in cases where people should not take over responsibility or are not capable of doing so. And when people are dying, that you have then the moral obligation as the one strong power to actually intervene. When we look at Russia, first of all, opposition's claim that we're increasing that we have better relations with Russia is simply not true. We have new sanctions on Russia. We have Russia dropping out of the G8. We have Russia actually being stronger in Syria and steamrolling over Crimea, eastern Ukraine, and Georgia. We say that the expansionism that Russia has done during the Obama administration is something that they couldn't have ignored. We don't say that we should have engaged in open warfare with Russia, but what we say is between doing actually nothing and doing something, there is Or like that doesn't have to necessarily mean that we're here for the sake of open warfare. For example, you could support, like give intelligence support to a country whose sovereignty is infringed by an outside power. So we don't see how that stands on their side of the debate today. The last point I'm going to talk about, no thank you, is the relations to US allies. We have two examples here, and three. So first of all, we talk about Cuba. We say that there are still sanctions, Cuba and Iran. We say that there are, first of all, still sanctions in Iran. We even have new sanctions that are just not nuclear related, so we don't see how that has really improved. We also see that Obama had huge timing issues. The approaches he made in with Cuba and Iran were in the second term, at a point where he couldn't make sure anymore that the progress he was actually trying to make would actually be continued or would actually be sustainable. But what we thirdly say is that through taking away sanctions and approaching those governments, we legitimize a system, for example, in Cuba that radically infringes upon human rights. The thing is that even like in these cases we haven't gained significant new allies, but what we do have is we have lost the ones that we already have. For example, Saudi Arabia. We'll explain this a bit with a high school examples. Okay, so imagine the following situation: you have a girlfriend, and your rival or person you don't like also has a girlfriend. Okay, now what you can't do is you can't flirt with your rival's girlfriend. Why? Because first of all, your girlfriend is gonna get mad, and in the worst case, we'll have a breakup, and both of us are gonna be sad. But secondly, we say that the rival's girlfriend is A, not going for it, in which case I'm standing there alone without my original girlfriend, or secondly, she can go for it, but which means that your rival is hating you even more than he is at the moment, which means he's going to be more aggressive towards you. Okay, so because Obama has created more problems than he fixed, and because he didn't take over the responsibility that they voluntarily took when they, for example, got into Libya or Egypt, this debate has to go to proposition. Thank you.
So what have we seen throughout this debate? We've seen a team proposition that has not only contradicted themselves throughout the whole speech, that hasn't engaged with our argumentation, and has compared the US foreign policy to a relationship problem. Yes, exactly that, a girlfriend-boyfriend problem. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What is the burden that they had to prove, and they failed to do so throughout the whole debate? That the Obama administration has caused more harm than good, not only to the homeland, but also to the outer world. So first of all, we'd like to clarify that not only did they not address the first part of their burden about the homeland, but the second thing we'll tell you is that they have been to prove it all along. So before we move to the points of clash of this debate, I would like to make some brief clarifications. So the first question we asked Team Proposition at the start of this debate is that, is this everything that they have spoken to us Obama's responsibility, and by consequence, if it is, why is it that they have the responsibility to intervene? So first of all, we saw of the first contradiction about the case, because the first speaker said, okay, they should do it because they can, as if no other country, no thank you, in the world can do so. But the second thing we would tell you is that the third speaker came up here contradicting himself, saying, okay, no, it's not his responsibility. So we'll take that answer. Let's analyze this. How is it that if it's not their responsibility, and the third speaker admitted to this, that they're saying that they are the ones that have to help and have to solve all the problems of the world? So the second clarification we will tell you is that they told us that we didn't understand what they said. So about the strategy and the wrong use of the strategy. So first of all, they didn't understand the debate here, because we're not asking their opinion about Obama's strategy. The second thing we will tell you is that what they had to prove is that that same strategy has caused more harm than good, not just give a list of economic problems and world problems in the world right now. And the second contradiction they had is when they said that they aren't that they didn't want an invasion and they weren't supporting active engagement, and then they said they criticized him for not invading in Syria, and then they criticized him for not moving forward with Russia apart from the economic sanctions. No, thank you. And the third contradiction that they said was that ISIS wasn't a consequence of the United States after saying that it was, and their main argumentation about terrorism was that it is. So if they conceded then that it wasn't a consequence of the United States, then how can they argumentate that this is a consequence of Obama's foreign policy? And the last clarification before the points of clash is the fact that they never engaged with our argumentation about the environment, which is another pillar of foreign policy, which they cleverly ignore, and it's far too late for them to do so now. And the second point about the pivot to the east. So no, thank you. So moving on to the first point of clash, the world crisis. So what have we seen here from Team Proposition? We saw a beautiful example of a lot of world crisis. And they use lovely phrases like misinterpretation of priorities and the analysis on Libya. So first of all, these phrases mean absolutely nothing if you give no analysis as to what they actually mean. The second thing we would tell you is that in cases like in Libya, what he did was respond to their allies' claims that they needed to invade, and that is clear foreign policy. The second thing what we told you is that this is actually approved by the United Nations. And the third thing we'll tell you is that the situation isn't as stable as they said it was. It's not that they went into Libya because they wanted to. So the second thing they told us was that Egypt and Syria are in, quote, a bad condition and they are suffering a lot. Okay, so good. We understand that this is happening and we are very sad for the situation. But first of all, why is it that it's Obama's fault that they are in such a bad situation?
Sir?
We believe that it's not, and they have given no argumentation as to saying that it was. The second thing we would tell you is that it's a nice explanation, but actually the Syrian crisis doesn't have anything to do with Obama. And it's precisely because of that Obama has engaged in a foreign policy with as little intervention as possible, because he understood that Syria had a lot of problems which weren't caused by them, and he said, okay, let's not invade, let's not send even more troops and kill even more lives. And no, thank you. And the third thing we would tell you is that the first responsibility that Obama has is to his people, to the U.S. troops, a burden that they have not analyzed throughout their whole speeches, and which we've repeated on and on. That first of all, he has to try to make the least amount of U.S. troops die on the ground, and then see what's happening in the world, something that they completely ignore. So another example they gave us was about Crimea. How, okay, he had to do more, but what more could he do? We explained to you that he imposed economic sanctions which are actually working to some extent, and the second thing we told you is that he cannot do any further because there is a certain extent to foreign policy before you go to direct invasion, and the only way further that he can go to is an invasion which would be not beneficial for the world as a whole. So they also told us, they gave us no analysis as to why this strategy isn't actually working, and that why this has caused more harm than good. And we have told you on the other side of the proposition that the lack of intervention, the less intervention possible, the less not only U.S. troops that die, but the less people on the ground from those countries that are dying. Two things which they have not engaged to. And the third point is about the Iraq. First of all, they give no concrete analysis on why Iraq is so bad for them. But let's take them on their highest moral ground, for example. If you're looking for a culprit for the Iraq war, the names are George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice, so that doesn't really apply to the Obama administration. But second of all, we would tell you that they had no even choice to not withdraw from Iraq because the popular support was actually against it. So even if they wanted to stay, they couldn't because the Iraqi people weren't in favor of that, something which they never refuted. So in our second point of clash, about the relationships. They spoke about, okay, the relationships with countries that are questionable morals and that are questionable, like Saudi Arabia or Cuba. So first of all, these are strategic alliances that make them actually go and change the system once they are aligned with them. The second thing we would tell you is that they have alliances with countries, but that doesn't mean that they are in favor of what those countries stand for. So just because they're allies with Saudi Arabia doesn't mean that the USA and the people start using burqas, for example. We don't see why it is that because having these alliances, they won't necessarily go and take their moral ground and do what they do. And the third thing we would tell you is that in the case of Cuba, first of all, what would you rather have them? Turn a blind eye on the Cuban crisis, on the lack of infrastructure, on the lack of resources that the people have? The second thing we would tell you is that he even brought more good than harm because he was able to actually go beyond their stubbornness, for example, of other presidents and say, okay, the Cuban people need help, they need access to our markets, they need access to the modernized world, so let's go and give them that. So even if we were to take them on their highest moral ground, we would see that the example of Cuba actually for us for our side. And another thing they told us was, okay, they have no new allies. They said, this is a problem. First of all, why is this a problem? Second of all, we would tell you that even if we would say that it doesn't prove that it's a bad thing, it just proves it doesn't prove that it causes more harm than good. And the third thing we'll tell you is that they have actually improved relationship with another country. And before moving to the third point, I'll take that.
Are you actually aware of the fact that Obama's plan for the reduction of carbon dioxide failed in front of the Supreme Court because they were taken there by the...
Okay, I understand your point. Firstly, the moment I clash with our environmental arguments wasn't in a point of information right now, it was before in your other speeches. The second thing we would tell you is that the fact that he's only making these countries even consider this and making it improving to a policy, it means that he has made significant change, but it's too late for you to clash with that. No, thank you. So the third point of clash, about terrorism. They said that ISIS is growing and that ISIS isn't Obama's, and they conceded that ISIS wasn't even Obama's fault, and they criticized him for not using airstrikes. So first of all, no, this isn't true. ISIS has actually been reduced to 1/3 of its territory. The second thing we would tell you is that by admitting that it wasn't Obama's fault, they are contradicting the whole case, and we would tell you that even that we have proven to you with concrete analysis how Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been debilitated, and how the less U.S. death and the less deaths on the ground actually make it work. So what have we proven to you without this debate? with our first argument about how Obama has maintained a foreign policy of the reduction of armed conflicts, of the restoring of diplomatic relationships, and the use of smart power, which involves economic, strategic, and diplomatic ways of using foreign policy, not only invasions. With our second argument about terrorism, how he actually fought and is winning the fight on terror, and with the fact of wars that he hasn't even started any new wars and even new conflicts. And with our third argument, which hasn't even been clashed at all, about the environment, how he is fighting the right and silent war. So, Mr. Speaker, if there is one message that must prevail from this debate, is that we have come to a point in history where we have to analyze Obama's foreign policy and Obama's administration and say where the flaws are. And let me tell you that foreign policy isn't one of those flaws. So we stand by the phrase that the State of the Union is as strong as ever. Thank you.
The day that Obama leaves office is the day that yes, we can will turn into yes, we did. And that is why, to analyze what we've seen in this debate, we'll answer three questions. The first one is, what to do with our military policy? The second one is, what should we focus on? And the third one is, can we hold hands and sing? So let's get to the first one. What should we do with our military policy? So coming out of the prop, they showed us two things. First, that they're not condoning or condemning anything. So first we tell you that this is not a clear stance. But moreover to this, they added by saying that Obama has done wrong. So they're not actively against it, passively in favor of it, or whatever, but they just say that Obama is wrong. So what did we tell you on the South Wall? We told you that we need to analyze what Obama has actually done to see what their stance is in this debate. So what has Obama done? He's actually advocated for non-intervention on his policies, and that is always. He hasn't changed that at all throughout his 8 years. So we see Obama is actually constant. So by saying that Obama has done wrong, they're actually opposing these non-interventionist policies. We see how Obama has used smart power, such as sanctions and targeted strikes. And they said, oh, but this was bad. So let's see what Obama could have done. What are the possible alternatives? So first we see that intervening was a possible alternative, which actually creates more power gap and possibly World War III in the case of Russia. So that is an alternative they have on their side. Another alternative is basically not doing anything. But yet again, they say that not doing anything is not an option because the almighty United States is always responsible for everything. So we see that what is the policy that is left for us to choose? We cannot intervene. We cannot do nothing. So what can we do? What Obama did. What Obama did, intervening in a smart way through sanctions and through targeted strikes. So yet again, we see how decreasing U.S. involvement prevents futile wars that last decades, kill a lot of people, and cost a lot of money. So we see on our side of the house, we show what Obama has done the best policy he could with regards to the military. So second question, what should we focus on? And they said, oh, we should focus on the crisis in Syria and Iraq. We told you that Obama has actually helped in aid in the situation in Iraq and Syria, but moreover we told you that a more important focus was the shift in policy towards long-term issues. We brought the argument of climate change, which there was no clash on by the silent proposition. Yet again, we see on our side, Obama has established negotiations and agreements with countries such as China on CO2 emissions, helping everyone around the world since climate change affects everyone in a great way. We see moreover, he's created awareness all around the world. That's why we're discussing this today, why Obama has actually been able to implant this idea today in society. We told you that Obama has actually established the pivot to the east, in which he started focusing on grander issues such as growing Asian economies and military powers in the Asian sector. We see he succeeded in actually improving the relations with Vietnam, with Malaysia, something that was yet again not clashed at all by the Southern proposition in this debate. So yet again, they failed to answer these two questions. So let's get to the last one. Can we hold hands and sing? On the side of the prop, they said, oh, we've created more enemies, we've lost many allies, we're in a worse position. We told you that Obama has actually established diplomatic relations with new countries such as Cuba and Iran. We told you that integrating these countries is beneficial to the world and these countries. Why? Because a country that is away from diplomacy, that is not integrated in the world, is not likely to change. These human rights violations would be even worse under their side of the house. So we see how befriending our friends and our enemies' girlfriends is actually positive since now Obama can mediate the problems between Saudi Arabia and Israel before they get into a conflict, or a bellic conflict that could cause the loss of lives of many people around the world. So lastly, we'd like to ask a question for the audience to take in today. Which allies has the United States actually lost? Because they haven't answered this question, brought no analysis, no examples. We see that how Obama has had the same allies that the United States had 10 years ago, but maybe now has even more such as Cuba and Iran. So we see how diplomacy is in fact always the best policy. That is why, Mr. Speaker, on our side of the House, we have a message for you. We want to say thanks to Obama for leaving the world better than how you found it in capable hands. Who knows who that might be or what she might do. Thank you.
A shallow misrepresentation of team proposition, mischaracterizing the situation and failing to show impacts of their arguments. These were the main strategic flaws that we saw today in team opposition side. Now, what I'll be doing in this reply speech is I'll be trying to move away from the countless examples we heard in this debate and looking at what actually happened on both sides of the teams. Now, I saw two main clashes. First of all, looking at strategy, both externally and domestic, then looking at allies, and then looking at which team actually was able to show according to these criteria of good foreign policy. Now, let me come to strategy first. Now, we need to fix some general problems of misrepresentation by team opposition that was a problem in this debate. Now, the first question, is it the US's job to fix all problems? No, it isn't, and this is something that team proposition never said. However, we gave you a more complicated and realistic view of the situation. So first of all, if US presence is already there, yes, indeed, it is the US's job to actually follow through with this and actually fix the things that are already there, if they're already there. And secondly, due to the fact that no other institution actually has the power to do this, and no actually has the resources to do this, or to mediate, to intervene, and because of the specific power of the US, yes, sometimes it is the US's job to intervene. Now, additionally to this, we showed you that we believe that neither an active nor a passive strategy is the universal answer. And we also showed you that in many cases there were indeed alternatives that were ignored. And this is something that was completely misrepresented and misunderstood by team opposition. And it's not a contradiction. It is a nuanced assessment of the situation, something that quite frankly we believe Obama should have done as well. Now, this actually brings us to the two main problems we saw in Obama's strategy. First of all, unsustainability and passive strategy, two principled arguments that were not tackled by team opposition. So if we look at unsustainability, we talked about overthrowing authoritarian regimes and dictatorships without specific regard to the situation in these countries and how it led to anarchy, for example, in Libya, and relapse, for example, in Egypt. And the second thing we showed you is the passive strategy, because sometimes the state can't or shouldn't take over responsibility, something that we analyzed for you and never got an answer from team opposition for. We showed you the countless effects this has had, talking about humanitarian crisis, talking about overspill, talking about empowerment of unreliable state actors, talking about anti-American sentiments and more leverage for authoritarian regimes. 5 points, none of which were sufficiently dealt with opposition. Now, the only thing they actually did was insufficiently tackling the examples, something that in reply speech I will not continue to do because it was sufficiently done by our third speaker. Now, the other thing was looking at security, looking at the environment. Now, this did not receive much attention in this debate, but in our POI, we were able to show you that Obama's plan was not able to follow through, and due to the fact that team opposition was not able to show actual impacts of their argument, we believe that this point is a point that can be tackled and actually falls down completely as well. Now, if we look at the other big clash in this debate, which was allies, we showed you that Obama failed to gain significant new allies while jeopardizing and losing relations to significant allies that are so important in this world. Looking at, for example, taking Israel to the negotiation table, looking at Saudi Arabia acting up. And we showed you that this was in return for not really gaining significant allies with, for example, Cuba and Iran, because there are still so many sanctions and such forth. The only thing that we heard from opposition is that we have better relations with Russia, something that simply falls on a factual level if we look at sanctions, if we look at G8 and such forth. Now, because team opposition was not able to show that Obama's strategy was efficient or sustainable, and because we showed you that these criteria fell on every possible way on our side of the house, because it was not efficient, because there were not minimal harms, and because there was not actually finding an efficient solution, because it was not sustainable, because the long-term solutions were not found in any way, looking at dictatorships, looking at the environment, looking at